The 22nd of April, 1943. North Pacific, 600 nautical miles east of the Kuriles. The wind scoured the sea into white, streaked ridges, and the waves broke like molten iron under the dull moonlight. Beneath that surface, 100, then 200, then 600 feet down metal groaned. Rivets flexed. Air pressure hissed through the valves of I-177 as the submarine knifed toward depths her designers had never intended her to reach. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Nakai, gripped the periscope handles, though the instrument was stowed, a reflex born of habit and terror. Above them, the enemy was listening. At 2,217 hours, sonar had found them. The first ping came like the crack of a hammer through the hull, bright and cold, echoing in every pipe and bulkhead. The Japanese called it con-con, the metallic heartbeat of the enemy. This one was unlike any they had heard before, cleaner, more insistent, repeating with mechanical precision every 3 seconds. The sound pierced the steel and reverberated through their bodies. It followed them as they descended, a spectral pulse chasing them into darkness. Depth 800 feet, the diving officer reported, his voice unnaturally steady. The pressure hull groaned audibly now, the gauges trembling under their own strain. The chief engineer whispered a warning. At 1,000, the hull may deform. But Nakai did not reply. He was listening to the ocean, to the rhythm of the American machine above. The pings were still there, still sharp, still tracking. For years, Japanese submariners had believed in depth as sanctuary. Pre-war doctrine, inherited from the Royal Navy's early Aztec studies and refined in the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine school at Kure, held that Allied sonar lost effectiveness below 300 or 400 feet. The water column itself, layers of salinity, temperature, and pressure would scatter and bend sound, breaking the pursuer's acoustic contact. Every submariner learned the same equations: sound, velocity, absorption coefficients, reflection angles. At 500 feet, safety was assumed. At 700, invisibility. That illusion ended tonight. The destroyer escort above them, USS Edwards, DE 231, was new to the war, new even to herself. Commissioned only 3 months earlier, she carried the Navy's latest sonar suite, the QGB-1, an evolution of the British Type 144 searchlight set. Unlike the early QC sonars that bathed the sea in unfocused bursts, the QGB emitted a tight, concentrated beam that could track a moving submarine continuously, adjusting for bearing and range in real time. The men aboard Edwards didn't know they were rewriting the laws of underwater warfare. They were simply doing what their training told them: hold the contact, maintain the ping, close for attack. At 2,235 hours, Edwards' sonar operator, Seaman Second Class Robert H. Mullen, heard the echo shift in tone, a faint Doppler change that meant the target was diving fast. Range decreasing 800 yards, still solid return. The ping cycle continued, steady as a metronome, while the helmsman turned the ship to keep the contact centered on the sonar beam. Above the hum of machinery, the bridge speakers ticked with each pulse. Ping, ping, ping. The sea itself seemed to be breathing in rhythm with the machine. Below, at 900 feet, the Japanese crew realized something impossible. The pings had grown louder. The sound was penetrating water that their textbooks said would scatter it. Nakai felt it vibrate in the soles of his feet, a living thing probing through the dark. "It's not fading," the navigator muttered, crossing himself out of habit more than faith. The helmsman's hands shook on the wheel. Men had gone mad before, in dives like this, when the hull began to sing and creak and the oxygen turned thick and sweet. But this was different. They weren't suffocating in silence, they were being hunted by sound. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had regarded anti-submarine warfare as a secondary art. Its submarines were designed for long-range reconnaissance and fleet engagement, not for commerce raiding or evasion. Their skippers memorized torpedo trajectories and surface attack geometry, not sonar propagation curves. American technology, the staff in Tokyo believed, was derivative machines without spirit, imitations of British concepts built by industrial hands. The Americans were predictable, methodical, limited by their own manuals. That faith held through 1942. Early U.S. sonar sets, operating at 14 to 18 kilohertzes, were indeed clumsy. Their effective range seldom exceeded 800 yards, and they lost contact once a submarine dropped below the thermocline. Japanese captains learned to dive steeply, settle at 500 feet, and wait. The destroyer would circle, drop a few depth charges, then wander off, blind. Survival was an equation of patience and pressure, but by the spring of 1943, something had changed. The Americans had refined the art of listening. In shipyards from Mare Island to Charleston, new sonar domes were being fitted to destroyers and escorts. The Bureau of Ships had introduced transducers of improved quartz construction, doubling their power output. The Navy's Sound School in Key West trained hundreds of operators to interpret the subtle shifts of echo intensity that marked depth changes. Oceanography, once a science of tides, had become a weapon system. The ocean itself was no longer neutral ground. At 2,242 hours, I-177 passed 1,000 feet. The chief engineer, sweating through his uniform, reported the forward ballast tanks bulging inward. "Captain, hull strain critical." The needle of the depth gauge quivered at the end of its scale. Men whispered prayers. And still the pings came, steady, precise, 3 seconds apart. "Can they still see us?" asked the executive officer, half in disbelief. Nakai didn't answer. He already knew. The sound was tracking their descent perfectly, adjusting with uncanny accuracy. This was no fading echo, it was an eye, an ear that never blinked. Then came the counterpoint, a low rumble from above, followed by distant thuds, the pattern of exploding depth charges, shallow, exploratory, not yet lethal. The Americans weren't guessing anymore. They were measuring. The sonar operator aboard Edwards was feeding bearing and range directly to the fire control computer, adjusting for the time delay between sound and detonation. The destroyer was calibrating the ocean. Nakai ordered silent running. All pumps stopped. The air grew thick, the temperature rising despite the cold outside. For 30 seconds there was silence. Then, through that silence, the ping returned clearer than before. "They've changed frequency," the sound man whispered. He was right. The Americans were sweeping through the thermocline, adjusting the sonar's pitch to compensate for refraction. It was science applied like a scalpel. Later analysis would show that I-177 survived the encounter by accident, slipping away into a thermal layer that finally distorted the beam enough to break contact. But for the men inside, that night marked the end of certainty. They surfaced after dawn to a flat grey horizon, the sky heavy with mist. Salt clung to every surface. The crew stood in silence on the bridge, each man replaying the sound in his memory, the perfect mechanical cadence of those pings. Nakai wrote in his patrol log that day, "Enemy equipment demonstrates remarkable precision, contact maintained to depths exceeding 1,000 feet. Previous assumptions regarding sonar limits no longer valid." The entry would later appear in captured Japanese naval records, examined by the Allied translator and interpreter section. It read like a scientist's admission, not a warrior's lament. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, that night was a revelation. Depth was no longer protection, and silence no longer safety. The ocean had changed sides. By mid-1943, across the Pacific, Japanese submariners would begin to whisper about a new enemy, one that hunted not by chance, but by certainty. The ping had become prophecy, and the deep no longer offered refuge. The war beneath the waves had entered a new age, and the sound of that age was a single, relentless note, echoing through 1,000 feet of black water. By summer 1943, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had become laboratories of mathematics. What had once been the uncertain art of listening for submarines evolved into a science of geometry, timing, and probability, where every ping, bearing, and echo delay could be reduced to numbers on a chart. The transformation was invisible to most sailors, but to those who lived by sound, it was the beginning of the most effective anti-submarine system in history. The roots of that change lay not in battle, but in conference rooms. In Washington, the Navy's Bureau of Ships, under Rear Admiral Harold Bowen, had quietly enlisted physicists, mathematicians, and acousticians from MIT, Bell Labs, and Harvard to perfect active sonar, then still called ASDIC, after its British origin. The task was straightforward in wording, but vast in implication: to turn the sea, long the submarine's shield, into an acoustic mirror. Every destroyer, every corvette, every escort would become a listening instrument. The early sets, the QC and QCA models, had been crude. Operators, trained more by ear than by science, described contacts as mushy or sharp, ringing or dead. A competent man might hold a submarine on his screen for 5 minutes, a lucky one for 15. But most of the time, the contact faded once the destroyer passed directly overhead to drop charges. The ocean's temperature layers refracted the sound beam, bending it upward, scattering it like light through glass. The result was frustration and randomness. Captains dropped explosives by instinct and prayed that somewhere below, metal cracked. That changed in early 1943 when the QGB and QHB series sets appeared in fleet service. Their transducers, cast from precision-ground quartz crystals, emitted narrow beams that could be steered like searchlights through the deep. For the first time, sonar could track rather than merely detect. Bearing and range updates flowed continuously, plotted on grease pencils across transparent plotting boards called attack plotters. The sonar's pulses were synchronized with the ship's speed, and heading through mechanical computers, early analog fire control systems that computed closing rate and predicted submarine motion. Sound had become arithmetic. At the Navy Sound School in Key West, instructors drilled into recruits a new lexicon: target rate, bearing drift, Doppler shift, aspect angle. Students sat in darkened huts, headphones clamped to their ears, listening to recorded pings on wax discs. One set recorded against dummy torpedoes, another against captured German U-boats. They learned to recognize not just the echo, but its tone. A steady, hollow return meant a deep, metallic hull. A fuzzy echo suggested a coral false target. The faint, rising whistle of a Doppler shift meant the submarine was closing. A downward slide meant it was fleeing. The average operator by 1944 could classify a contact's motion within seconds. Some became legends, men like Chief Sonarman William O'Hara aboard USS England, who could track a Japanese submarine at 1,500 yards through thermal gradients that baffled lesser crews. O'Hara called it riding the echo. When asked how, he shrugged. You stop listening to the ping, you start listening to what isn't there. To Japanese submariners, this refinement manifested as terror. Before, a destroyer's sonar might sweep, lose them, and move on. Now the pings grew steady, exact, remorseless. They didn't fade, they adjusted. The enemy had learned the mathematics of persistence. The science that powered that persistence came from unlikely places. At Columbia University's Division of War Research, physicist Maurice Ewing and his graduate students were mapping the sound velocity profile of the ocean. Using hydrophones dropped on weighted lines, they charted how temperature and salinity affected the travel of sound. They discovered that under certain conditions, sound refracted downward and then back up again, forming a sound channel that could carry sonar pulses for miles with little loss. The Navy called it the Deep Sound Channel, and by mid-1943, destroyers were adjusting sonar frequencies to exploit it. What had once been random luck became predictable physics. Meanwhile, the mathematicians of the Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group, ASWOG, began to treat the ocean as a giant probability grid. Each search pattern, each turn radius, each sonar sweep angle was optimized through equations that balanced time, fuel, and detection probability. Their conclusion was radical. better to make fewer, smarter pings than to flood the sea with noise. Continuous pinging told submarines where you were. Measured, deliberate pulses kept them guessing while maintaining contact. The new doctrine spread quietly through the fleet, written not as poetry but as procedure. Ping every 5 seconds at closing ranges under 1,000 yards, every 10 at greater distances. Shift frequency when crossing thermal layers. The results were immediate and brutal. Contact holding time doubled, then tripled. By late 1943, American destroyer escorts could maintain sonar contact for 4-5 minutes long enough to execute multiple attack runs. Kill probability per attack rose from 7% in 1942 to nearly 30% by the end of 1944. The ocean had become a plotted, predictable domain. But the true revolution came when that math was given teeth, the hedgehog. Designed in 1942 and deployed widely by 1943, it was the first weapon married directly to sonar data, a spiked array of 24 mortar tubes mounted on the bow. It fired small contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship in a tight pattern, allowing the sonar operator to keep the target in the beam while attacking. Unlike depth charges, which detonated by preset depth, the Hedgehog's warheads exploded only on impact, meaning that silence after the salvo meant a miss, but an echoing thump meant a kill. To the submarine below, it was the most terrifying innovation of all. The sound pattern was distinct. First, the mechanical thunk, thunk, thunk of the mortars launching, then the eerie pause as the bombs fell silently through the water, then, if you were unlucky, a chain of rapid, muffled detonations directly around the hull. It was death measured in seconds, not minutes. The Japanese called it the sound of nails in a coffin. By autumn 1943, Allied destroyers operated not as hunters of chance, but as mathematicians with depth charges. Each sonar contact was a problem to be solved, bearing rate, range, target speed, predicted maneuver. They plotted courses with the same precision, an artilleryman plotted trajectories. The old instinctive chase gave way to procedural annihilation. In that change lay the end of Japanese submarine warfare, as it had been conceived, a world where silence and depth no longer guaranteed survival. The pings that once wandered aimlessly through the ocean now marched like soldiers, disciplined and deliberate. Every echo was measured, every silence analyzed. The sea had been mapped not by charts or compasses, but by mathematics, and beneath it, men who once believed in the sanctuary of depth began to understand that even the abyss could be calculated. By late spring 1943, the hunt for submarines had lifted off the sea. The same mathematical precision that had reshaped sonar was now climbing into the air on wings of steel and radar. The ocean surface, once a barrier between hunters and hunted, became a transparent membrane through which sound and magnetism could pass. For the Japanese submariner, the horizon was no longer safety, it was a mirror filled with aircraft. The U.S. Navy's transformation from surface hunter to airborne predator began with a simple idea. The submarine's shadow did not vanish when it dove. It left traces magnetic, acoustic, thermal that could be followed. By 1943, American scientists had found ways to detect each. The tools that would make this possible, sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and the acoustic homing torpedo, arrived within months of each other, forming a triad of detection so comprehensive that by 1944, no ocean was truly deep enough. The first sonobuoys were small miracles of improvisation. Cylinders little larger than depth charges, they parachuted from patrol aircraft, splashed down, and unfurled hydrophones on long cables that hung 40 feet below the surface. Each buoy transmitted sound back to the aircraft by radio. Early models, codenamed AN, CRT-1, could operate for only 4 hours, but that was enough. Dropped in lines or grids, they formed temporary acoustic nets that trapped submarines between the surface and the sea floor. Lieutenant Ye-Ji, Albert Rawlings of Patrol Squadron VP-54, described their first use in the Solomons in July 1943. We dropped 6, then circled back. The set operator began calling bearings like a man possessed. You could hear the submarine turning. The pings came back through the headphones, clear as a bell. It was like listening to a blind man feel his way through a hallway you'd built just for him. Below, in the Japanese submarine I-11, the crew heard something new, a chorus of distant, mechanical heartbeats. The sound seemed to come from all around, overlapping in strange harmonics. At first, they thought it was echo ranging from multiple destroyers. Then they realized the truth. The Americans had scattered listening devices into the sea itself. Depth and silence no longer protected them. They were surrounded by ears. If the sonobuoy was the hunter's net, then magnetic anomaly detection MAD was the spear that struck from above. Based on work at the Naval Research Laboratory and refined by the Canadians, MAD relied on measuring minute distortions in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the mass of a steel submarine. Mounted in the tail booms of patrol aircraft, it could sense a submerged target within 800 feet of the surface. For years, Japanese commanders had assumed aircraft could not harm a submarine once it submerged. That assumption died over the Bismarck Sea on the 10th of October 1943. A TBF Avenger from Bombing Squadron 107, piloted by Lieutenant Yeji A. Jun E. Morgan, picked up a faint magnetic spike just as his radar lost the contact. Morgan turned into the signal, throttled back, and dropped a single 325-pound depth bomb. The explosion blew RO-108 to the surface in two pieces. The entire sequence from detection to destruction had lasted less than 30 seconds. For the Japanese survivors clinging to debris, it seemed as if the sky itself had learned to see beneath the sea. Then came the final evolution, the weapon that hunted by listening, the Mark 24 mine. It was not truly a mine but an acoustic homing torpedo, the first of its kind. Developed in secret by the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and the Bureau of Ordnance, it entered service in April 1943. To preserve secrecy, all official paperwork called it Mine, Mark 24, a deception so successful that Japanese intelligence never understood what was killing them. The Mark 24, nicknamed Fido by the crews who carried it, was a small, stubby weapon only 19 inches in diameter and 7 feet long. Dropped from an aircraft at 100 feet altitude, it entered the water nose first and then circled, listening. Its hydrophone array, tuned to the low-frequency cavitation noise of submarine propellers, could home on a target at ranges up to 400 yards. Once it locked on, it followed the sound like a predator following scent. Its 92-pound Torpex warhead was small but lethal against thin submarine hulls. The first confirmed Fido attack occurred on the 14th of May 1943, when a PBY Catalina of VP-84 caught U-640 attempting to submerge off Greenland. The torpedo's track was invisible from the surface, only a spreading circle of foam, but the sonar buoys recorded what followed: a faint rising hum, a metallic clang, then silence. The post-war Allied translator and interpreter section later captured Japanese accounts describing similar sounds: a propeller approaching from nowhere, a vibration in the hull, then sudden pressure. To men below. It was as though the ocean itself had turned sentient. The U.S. Navy's 13 Fighter Command in the Pacific integrated these tools into doctrine faster than any force in history. By late 1943, coordination between surface escorts and patrol aircraft had become routine. Destroyers forced submarines to dive, aircraft waited overhead, laying buoys and scanning with MAD gear. Once a magnetic contact aligned with acoustic bearings, the aircraft dropped a Fido. The combination of surface sonar, airborne sensors, and self-guided weapons made escape nearly impossible. Between April 1943 and the end of the war, the Mark 24 accounted for 37 confirmed submarine kills, 14 German, 23 Japanese, out of 142 torpedoes dropped, a 26% kill rate, unprecedented for anti-submarine weapons. By comparison, depth charge attacks averaged less than 7%. The psychological toll on Japanese crews was catastrophic. In the words of Commander Takuma Fujita, surviving officer of I-361, interrogated in 1000, 945. We could not hide. When aircraft appeared, even cloud cover offered no safety. We would dive deep, stop engines, wait. Then we would hear something in the water, no propellers, only a faint turning. It was as if a small creature searched for us. Then, an explosion. It was not warfare, it was execution. What began as experimentation had become orchestration. Each machine-pinging destroyer, circling aircraft, drifting buoy, played a note in a symphony of pursuit. The Americans had linked ocean, sky, and mathematics into one weapon system. The Japanese submarine force, already stretched by fuel shortages and Allied code breaking, found itself besieged not by numbers alone, but by precision. The ocean that had once hidden their empire's steel wolves was now filled with invisible nets and listening ghosts. Every ripple carried danger, every echo doom. By 1944, the surviving Japanese captains spoke of the sea as haunted a place where unseen hunters moved with machine logic and perfect timing. They had learned the final lesson of the Pacific War's technological ascent. The air itself had learned to listen. By early 1944, the deep had ceased to be a refuge and become a trap. Japanese submarine captains still dove, still prayed to depth and silence, but their prayers rose against a new god, American production. The ocean was no longer defined by physics alone, it was defined by factories. The rhythm of the pings that haunted them at 1,000 feet was the same rhythm of the presses at Bethlehem Steel, the lathes at Mare Island, the shift whistles at Electric Boat. Each ping represented not just technology, but the multiplication of its sonar sets by the hundreds, destroyer escorts by the dozens each month, trained operators by the thousands. The Japanese believed their courage could outmatch American machines. By 1944, they began to realize that courage was a finite resource, but industry was not. Japan's submarines were built for endurance and prestige, not mass. Each I-class boat was a miniature capital ship, long-range, heavily armed, with crews trained for individual initiative. The I-400 class, conceptualized as aircraft carriers beneath the sea, was a masterpiece of engineering and folly. 400 feet long, 5,000 tons submerged displacement, able to launch Seran floatplanes from a sealed hangar. But there were only 3 of them. The United States, in the same time, produced 563 destroyer escorts, each with sonar, radar, depth charge throwers, hedgehogs, and doctrine. Japanese submariners called their boats castles of the deep. The Americans built their hunters like assembly line bullets, simple, replaceable, and unstoppable. Each Japanese submarine took roughly 2 years from keel to commission. An American destroyer escort required less than 4 months. The Evarts and Buckley classes, mass-produced by Kaiser shipyards, rolled off slipways faster than Japan could lay down a single hull. Even as Allied bombing crippled steelworks in Kobe and Yokosuka, the American yards worked under floodlights 24 hours a day. Production numbers told the story better than any admiral. By 1944, the United States Navy operated over 4,000 sonar-equipped ships. Japan, fewer than 50, with even rudimentary anti-submarine capability. The sea, once neutral, was now industrialized. For Japanese crews, diving deep had been ritual. The creaks and moans of the hull at 500 feet sounded like a chant, each metallic groan a reminder of courage. But the illusion of safety rested on incomplete science. The Imperial Navy's pre-war testing facilities at Kure and Yokosuka could only simulate 600 feet of pressure. Depth gauges were calibrated to 330 feet, their glass faces cracking under strain in actual combat. When Allied sonar began tracking them at double that depth, the men realized they were fighting ghosts armed with instruments beyond their understanding. In post-war interrogations, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Fukumura of I-185 recalled, "At 1,000 feet, we thought no signal could reach us. We heard pings clearly, as though someone struck the hull. The sonar was not fading, it was following. We believed we were safe under the thermocline. That belief died that night. American reports confirm it." The improved QHB sonar, introduced in late 1943, penetrated thermal layers once thought impenetrable. Operators learned to shift frequencies, alternating between 14 and 24 kHz, exploiting different refraction patterns. The mathematical tables printed by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution allowed even average crews to predict when and where sound would bend. Where Japanese submariners had superstition, Americans had data. The disparity extended beyond technology. It was human infrastructure. The U.S. Navy established sonar schools from Key West to San Diego, turning thousands of farm boys into acoustic experts. They learned to read bearing drift and echo intensity like Morse. Their Japanese counterparts, by contrast, had no equivalent training pipeline. Sonar operators were elite specialists attached to capital ships, not submarines. By 1944, Japan's few remaining acousticians were defending the home islands or dead in convoy battles. When I-37 was sunk off Java in November 1944, its last radio message to headquarters included the line, "Enemy detected us at depth below 800 feet. Impossible by known science." It was not exaggeration. To them, science had boundaries. To the Americans, it was an open frontier funded by production and experiment. Meanwhile, the destroyer escorts multiplied. The USS England, DE 635, became legend after sinking 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days using hedgehog attacks guided by sonar. Each kill was recorded in the log with chilling precision. Contact maintained, range 1,200 yards, firing pattern, 2 explosions, oil and debris sighted. There was no guesswork, no drama, just procedure executed with mechanical reliability. The Japanese called these escorts Iron Bees, small, persistent, and fatally accurate. They moved in hunter packs, communicating by radio and radar, each one a node in an industrial network. Fukumura's crew, and hundreds like them, began to recognize a pattern. The pings were always the same. Whether off New Guinea, the Marshalls, or the Marianas, the sound was identical, clear, rhythmic, machine-precise. The Americans had standardized not just their ships, but their sound. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships had mandated quality control so strict that even the pitch of sonar pulses was uniform across fleets. For Japanese crews, it was as if the same ghost haunted every ocean. By 1944, Japanese Submarine Command began issuing orders to dive no deeper than 600 feet. Hull stress failures had increased sharply. Several boats imploded attempting to evade sonar that would not fade. I-178 vanished with all hands after diving below test depth off Australia. RO-110 was crushed in the Indian Ocean. Captains started refusing deep dives, preferring to surface and fight. It made no difference. Radar and aircraft made the surface equally fatal. The war beneath the sea had become one of attrition, and Japan had nothing left to attrit with. The Americans fought with replacement schedules, not repair plans. Every destroyer escort lost could be replaced in weeks. Every sonar operator could be retrained in days. Japan fought with irreplaceable men, each sunk submarine carrying a year's worth of training, a decade's worth of experience. When the USS Samuel S. Miles reported contact lost at 1,200 feet in March 1944, her sonar officer wrote in the margin of his report, "The ocean gives up its secrets if you ask in the right frequency." The Japanese never found that frequency again. By the end of 1944, the illusion of safety through depth was dead. Pressure hulls could resist physics, but not production lines. American sonar had become the voice of an industrial civilization that could afford to measure the ocean molecule by molecule. Each ping was an equation solved by factories, laboratories, and millions of anonymous workers who would never see the sea they conquered. For the men inside the steel coffins of the Imperial Navy, the pings at 1,000 feet were no longer merely sound, they were prophecy. They foretold a world where strength no longer came from bravery or tradition, but from precision, coordination, and scale. In the Pacific of 1944, The deep ocean was no longer the Empire's refuge. It was America's factory floor, January 1944, Solomon Sea. Night. The horizon was black glass, and the rain hissed like static across the ocean's skin. On the bridge of the USS Whitehurst DE 634, Lieutenant Commander Clarence G. Broussard listened to the sonar reports coming through his headset, his voice low, deliberate. Contact steady range 1,200 yards, bearing drift left, slow. Beneath his feet, the ship's bow trembled with the thrum of the sonar beam pulse. Echo, pulse again, each ping a heartbeat in steel. The target below was Japanese, moving slowly west at 2 knots, trying to disappear under a thermocline layer. Broussard's crew did not chase the Echo as destroyers once had. They stalked it. The sonar operator called changes in bearing every few seconds. The helmsman adjusted by half degrees. The contact held. It was a discipline born of 2 years of evolution, a new doctrine where precision replaced instinct. Bearing steady, range 1,000. Fire Hedgehog. The order travelled down to the forward deck where 24 stubby mortar tubes tilted skyward. A ripple of soft thumps followed the Hedgehog projectiles leaping ahead of the ship in a fan. Each 65-pound bomb traced its arc, entered the water 200 yards in front of the bow, and fell silently. In the sonar shack, the operator switched to passive mode. No depth charges would follow. Silence meant suspense. Then, 4 sharp concussions. The deck shuddered. The sonar screen went blank, filled with static snow. When it cleared, there was no echo. Oil and wreckage floated to the surface. Contact destroyed. That single encounter condensed the entire metamorphosis of Allied anti-submarine warfare. For decades, the destroyer's attack was an act of faith, throwing hundreds of pounds of TNT into the blind, deep and hoping chance would oblige. Now it had become marksmanship. The Hedgehog transformed sonar from a warning device into a weapon sight. The idea had begun not in a shipyard, but in a drawing room at the British Admiralty in 1941. Engineers realized that a forward-firing pattern would allow a ship to keep sonar contact throughout the attack. Traditional depth charges, dropped astern, forced a destroyer to pass over its target, losing contact during the critical seconds before detonation. The Hedgehog's projectiles were smaller but precise. Each detonated only on contact, meaning that silence after the launch meant survival, while a single muffled explosion meant death. When the United States adopted the weapon in 1943, the effect was immediate. The kill rate per attack rose threefold. In fleet tests, 27% of Hedgehog attacks resulted in destruction compared to 7% for depth charges. The difference lay not in explosive power, but in information. Sonar no longer guided guesses, it guided trajectories. Every sonar operator became part gunner, part mathematician. They learned to translate bearing drift into firing angles, echo strength into range. When a ship turned, the sonar beam turned with it, adjusting for parallax and Doppler shift. The entire system transducer, analog computer, projector formed a feedback loop of exquisite precision. The destroyer escort was now a machine built around one purpose: translating sound into geometry, geometry into annihilation. For Japanese submariners, the Hedgehog's arrival was like the appearance of a new law of nature. They had grown accustomed to depth charges, predictable, survivable with skill. The patterns were wide. The detonations came in thunderous rolling waves. A captain could often outwit them by diving deeper or changing course at the right second. But the Hedgehog offered no warning, no rhythm. There was only a sudden silence, then a string of pin-sharp explosions that seemed to materialize from the water itself. Survivors from RO-44 later told interrogators, "We heard small splashes, like rain." Then a second later, the hull shook 4 times. It was not like depth charges, it was close, sharp. The pressure wave was small but concentrated. The lights went out instantly. Hedgehog detonations produced less dramatic surface plumes, so crews above saw little. But hydrophones recorded a pattern of brief, precise acoustic signatures, 24 impacts spaced by milliseconds, a soundscape of mathematical death. Doctrine evolved with the weapon. Destroyer escorts no longer circled aimlessly after each pass. They executed creeping attacks. One ship maintained sonar contact while another advanced silently to fire. The geometry was calculated on chartboards covered in grease pencil arcs. Position, target course, closing rate, ship speed, all computed by slide rule or instinct. The creeping ship would advance at 4 knots, drop a hedgehog salvo, then back away, letting the listening ship judge success by the absence or presence of echoes. The new system turned escort groups into orchestras of sound. Each ship played a note, pings in measured cadence, transmissions in coded brevity. Hold contact, target turning, ready hedgehog. It was war as composition, each sonar pulse a beat in a mechanical symphony that ended with silence below. To the Japanese, silence had once meant salvation. Now it was a prelude to attack. They realized that the Americans no longer hunted blindly. Every ping was a prelude, every pause deliberate. The hedgehog's precision made deep evasions futile. Even the slightest echo deviation betrayed motion. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had fired more than 7,000 hedgehog patterns across both oceans. Over 300 confirmed submarine kills were credited to the weapon, but its greater legacy was psychological. For the first time, submariners understood that the enemy's pings were not random, they were crosshairs. Commander Kenichi Iwasaki, captured after I-45's sinking, described the transformation simply. We no longer feared noise, we feared silence. When the pings stopped, we knew they had fired. In the space of 2 years, the Allied navies had replaced volume with precision, instinct with calculus. The old war of guesswork had become an industry of measured certainty. Beneath the waves, every submarine now lived inside a geometry it could not escape, a geometry drawn by the sound of progress itself. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific had become a laboratory. Beneath the noise of propellers and the chaos of convoys, something remarkable was happening in the quiet halls of research stations from San Diego to Woods Hole. Mathematicians, physicists, and young officers in white lab coats were rewriting the language of the sea. Their formulas, once confined to chalkboards, were being transmitted as pings across half the world's oceans. Every echo from a Japanese submarine returned not only sound but data, feeding a machine network of science that was as relentless as it was invisible. War had turned acoustics into arithmetic. The foundations of this revolution began in rooms filled with oscillographs and stopwatches. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Naval Research Laboratory, joined by the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory, realized that sonar was no longer an art. It was a measurable discipline. Every depth layer, temperature gradient, and salinity change altered sound velocity. These variables, once mysterious, could be calculated. The deep scattering layer, first noted by Scripps scientists in 1942, explained why echoes sometimes appeared to move like living things, because plankton and fish reflected sound. What had seemed superstition to sonar men in the field was now mapped with precision. By early 1944, sonar tables issued to destroyer escorts contained columns of correction factors for temperature and depth, allowing operators to predict refraction with surprising accuracy. Where Japanese officers still trusted instinct and experience, Americans trusted computation. The new confidence came from men who never saw combat. At the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, physicist Alan Vine and his colleagues created mathematical models of how sonar pulses bent through layers of seawater. Each thermal boundary acted as a lens, focusing or dispersing the sound beam. When operators learned to skip their sonar off these layers like throwing stones across a pond, they could track submarines beyond direct line of sight. Vine later called it acoustic artillery. In one experiment, sonar pulses were recorded striking a submerged submarine target at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards, twice what doctrine had once considered possible. The effect in combat was immediate. Allied destroyers began detecting Japanese submarines long before they could approach convoys. The tables had been turned. The ambusher had become the ambushed. Meanwhile, a young naval engineer named Albert B. Wood worked on refining the QHB sonar transducer. The older oscillators had been heavy, unreliable, and difficult to maintain. Wood's design used piezoelectric quartz stacks, smaller and more stable under pressure. This innovation allowed mass production of standardized sonar sets, meaning that every new destroyer escort, leaving a Kaiser or Mare Island yard, carried the same voice. The war's acoustic language had become unified, industrialized, and infinitely replicable. To a Japanese listener, every American sonar sounded identical, same rhythm, same frequency, same mechanical calm. It was as if one mind commanded all. In Tokyo, the Naval Technical Department, Kaitenbu, recognized the danger too late. Japanese engineers began experimenting with countermeasures, rubber coatings to absorb sound, oil slicks to scatter pulses, decoy noisemakers called Pillenwerfer copied from German models. But the materials were scarce, and their ships lacked the electrical generation to power effective jammers. American engineers, in contrast, treated sonar like radar, constantly iterating. They added narrow beam focusing and variable depth projectors. The QHB-1 could change frequency mid-ping, confusing decoys. The QHB-3 introduced automatic range plotting, printing real-time traces on paper drums. By 1945, the sonar range recorder turned what had once been an auditory skill into a visual instrument. Now, even an average operator could read the ocean like a chart. One destroyer escort officer wrote home, "We don't hear them anymore, we see them on paper." The more the Americans reduced the ocean to mathematics, the more the Japanese clung to mysticism. In submarine wardrooms, captains carried Shinto charms against detection, prayed to sea spirits, and spoke of the angry god of pings. Their engineers still believed American sonar could not function beyond 600 feet. That superstition ended when RO-107 was tracked and destroyed at a measured depth of 1,050 feet. The sonar operator aboard USS England recorded the contact as clear, steady, echo strength constant. The myth of the deep as sanctuary was gone forever. What remained was fear and awe. In post-war interrogation, Commander Shigeo Kato said, "It was as though they had learned to think with the ocean itself. We could not hide from mathematics." By late 1944, the geometry of sound had become America's most lethal weapon. Every ship's sonar pulse was a node in a continental equation, factories producing parts, universities solving equations, sailors executing procedures. It was warfare conducted through abstraction, tables, charts, graphs, and frequencies. The Japanese submariner, once master of stealth, now lived inside a grid of numbers he could not see and could never escape. Each ping from above was no longer just sound, it was a coordinate in the Allied solution to total war. The ocean itself had been quantified, and the result was annihilation by calculation. By January 1945, the sea lanes north of Luzon and east of Formosa were no longer hunting grounds for the Imperial Navy's submarines, they were minefields of sound. The American destroyer escorts prowled in convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon, each one radiating disciplined waves of sonar pulses that merged into a single, rhythmic hum. Beneath this network, the remaining Japanese submarines moved like ghosts, outdated, outnumbered, and deafened by their own futility. The I-48, one of the last operational long-range boats, left Kure in late January with a final, desperate mission: intercept an American task group near Ulithi and deliver 2 Kaiten human torpedoes. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Kagechika Tamai, carried orders written in brush and ink by Vice Admiral Takagi himself: strike decisively, even unto death. What he did not know was that his route was already mapped, his frequencies monitored, and the ocean ahead transformed into a grid of acoustic traps. The I-48's first contact came at 0217 on the 23rd of January 1945. Somewhere in the Black Pacific, a destroyer escort from Escort Division 56, USS Conklin DE 439, picked up a faint echo 1,800 yards off her port bow. The sonar operator, Seaman First Class Joseph T. Duncan, noted it calmly. "Contact clear, Doppler down, bearing steady." He didn't need to raise his voice. The process had become mechanical, ritualized. Commander D.A. Gibson ordered the Conklin to slow to 5 knots and began a textbook creeping attack. For 2 hours, the Japanese crew dove deeper, the hull groaning as the gauge needle passed 700 feet, then 900. Tamai gave no order to blow tanks. He believed, as most of his generation still did, that the deeper they went, the safer they became. But the ping followed steady, sharp, patient. Then came silence. To the American crew, that meant alignment. At 0345, Conklin fired a full hedgehog salvo. Seconds later, 4 contact detonations shook the sea. Oil, wood fragments, and shredded documents surfaced. Tamai and his 122 men vanished with their boat. The sonar record 22 seconds of rising echo followed by void was archived, analyzed, and filed as another solved equation. The destruction of I-48 symbolized the final collapse of Japan's undersea campaign. Out of 190 submarines operational in 1941, fewer than 40 remained afloat by spring 1945. Many were sunk before they ever reached their patrol zones. The reason was not simply radar or aircraft, it was the perfection of American coordination. The sea had become a single integrated weapon system. Sonar contact initiated by one ship could be handed seamlessly to another, then to aircraft overhead. The signals passed through standardized reporting codes, Q messages encrypted and transmitted by radio to Fleet Command. The once chaotic hunt had become automation by doctrine. Each submarine lost was not just a tactical defeat, it was the end of an era. The Imperial Navy had entered the war believing that courage, stealth, and individual brilliance could overcome industrial scale. The Americans had replaced brilliance with system. The difference was existential. Inside the surviving Japanese submarines, morale collapsed under the weight of that realization. Reports recovered after the war showed meticulous log entries turning into fatalistic poetry. From RO 109, sunk in February 1945, the final entry read, "The ocean is full of voices. The Americans speak with metal tongues. We cannot outthink their sound." Another from I-58, which survived the war only to become infamous for sinking the USS Indianapolis, recorded that depth has become a lie. Her sonar officer wrote that pings were now heard. Clearly, even below 900 feet, the sound like nails struck into the hull. The submariners no longer believed in steel, they believed in inevitability. To the Americans, the process had become routine. In the combat information centers of destroyer escorts, young men barely out of high school plotted range arcs on phosphorescent screens with grease pencils. Ping, sweep, range, fire, the litany of sound and movement. The ocean that had once terrified them was now a problem to be solved with trigonometry. Between January and August 1945, U.S. anti-submarine forces in the Pacific conducted 212 coordinated attacks. Of those, 168 resulted in confirmed kills. The kill-to-contact ratio, once barely measurable in 1942, had climbed to over 60%. For every Japanese submarine that survived its first contact, 3 were annihilated before surfacing again. When the war ended, the surviving Japanese officers were interrogated by U.S. Navy intelligence at Yokosuka. Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Hashimoto, former captain of I-58, spoke candidly, "We thought we were hunters. In truth, we were already prey. When you heard the ping, it was not sound, it was a verdict." The interrogators asked if he believed American technology was superior. Hashimoto shook his head. "Not just technology, system. You built a machine that never tired, never feared, never guessed. We built heroes. You built factories." By VJ Day, the Pacific was silent again. The pings ceased, the sonars shut down, and the ocean reclaimed its calm. But for the men who had lived beneath it, that silence was not peace, it was aftermath. In post-war reunions decades later, American sonar operators would describe the same feeling, that when they listened to the sea in peacetime exercises, they still expected to hear echoes coming back. None ever did. In that silence lay the memory of an invisible war fought entirely by sound, an arithmetic of life and death, where the ocean itself had become the battlefield, and where every ping marked the end of another empire's breath. In the months after Japan's surrender, the Pacific grew unnaturally quiet. The pings that had once filled every sea lane faded into memory. Destroyer escorts returned to their home ports and tied up in rows, their sonar domes crusted with barnacles, their operators discharged back to towns that would never understand what they had done. For 3 years, they had fought an invisible war of geometry and patience, hunting echoes in black water. When the fighting stopped, many found that silence harder to bear than the noise of battle. At the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, the same physicists and engineers who had forged the weapons of acoustic war now gathered in post-war conferences to assess what they had created. The Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory, which had developed the Fido torpedo, was dissolved into peacetime research programs. At Woods Hole, the sound-ranging data collected from thousands of submarine hunts became the foundation for a new science oceanography. What had begun as a tool for killing was reborn as a tool for knowing. But even as the laboratories turned to peace, the echoes of 1943-45 lingered in the minds of those who had heard them. In 1946, a joint U.S.-Japanese technical committee met in Yokosuka to review captured records from both sides. Among the documents were the last sonar traces of dozens of Japanese submarines, the thin pencil lines of oscillograph paper showing echoes fading, returning, then vanishing forever. Each curve represented a death few had witnessed, recorded only in the vibration of sound waves. The Americans read these charts like accountants tallying a balance sheet of the abyss. The Japanese officers, many now emaciated from captivity, stared at them as if looking at ghosts. One of them, Commander Shigeo Kato, the man who had once said that America thought with the ocean itself, asked to listen to an archived sonar recording. The technicians obliged. From an old magnetic wire reel came the sound, rhythmic pings fading into silence, then a short burst of static. Kato bowed his head. "That was us," he whispered. "That was my world ending." Even as the war's moral reckonings began, its technological legacy accelerated. The same sonar transducers that had once hunted submarines were now repurposed for mapping the seafloor. The data collected during wartime searches revealed something unsuspected: the mid-ocean ridges, trenches, and fracture zones of the Pacific Basin. Within a decade, those wartime soundings would help scientists confirm the theory of plate tectonics. In a strange symmetry, the tools that had annihilated the Imperial Navy also unveiled the planet's hidden architecture. For many veterans, this transformation offered a kind of redemption. Lieutenant Albert Rawlings, one of the first men to use sonobuoys in the Solomons, later joined the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. "We used to drop ears into the ocean to find enemies," he told a reporter in 1958. "Now we drop them to listen to whales. The sea hasn't changed. We have." But not everyone found solace. Some could never separate the hum of a ship's sonar from memory. In letters preserved at the Naval Historical Center, former sonar operators described dreams filled with phantom echoes, the sound of pings returning from nothing, of unseen hulls collapsing under pressure. One wrote, "At night I still hear it ping, echo, silence." That last silence was always the loudest. Across the Pacific, Japan's surviving submariners built small memorials along the coastlines, granite tablets engraved not with names but with hull numbers, I-48, RO-44, I-177. Each marker faced the sea, as if waiting for the sound to come back. At ceremonies in Kure and Yokosuka, aging officers spoke of honor and loss, but among themselves they admitted the deeper truth. that they had been defeated not by better sailors, but by a civilization that had learned to industrialize knowledge. By the 1,960 seconds, the sonar pulsed the sharp metallic ping born from the fear of submarines had become the universal sound as of the Cold War. Nuclear boats prowled the same depths once haunted by I-class submarines, each now armed with weapons that could erase cities. The echo of the Second World War had evolved into a global conversation between machines: ping, reply, ping again. Beneath the polar ice, American and Soviet submarines listened for one another, their sonars whispering through water that no longer belonged to nature but to history. In 1985, at a reunion in Pearl Harbor, American destroyer veterans and former Japanese submariners met for the first time. Someone played a restored recording of a wartime sonar track through a loudspeaker. The room fell silent. The sound, pure, clinical, rhythmic, filled the air. An American veteran leaned toward his former enemy and said quietly, "That sound used to mean death." The Japanese officer nodded. "It still means memory." The war of pings and echoes had ended 4 decades earlier, but its lesson outlasted both empires. The ocean, once thought infinite, had been mapped, measured, and conquered not by ships or guns, but by persistence, precision, and thought. Beneath its calm surface lay the ghostly remains of hundreds of submarines, each still listening, still silent. Somewhere in the dark, a sonar pulse might still bounce from a corroded hull, returning an echo, faint but clear, a final reminder that even in silence, the sea remembers.